What if Trump's tariffs weren't just economic policy, but a moral one? They'd certainly be trickier to argue against, right? Well, this is the question that gets raised when the new justification for Trump's broad-based tariffs is that he's targeting countries who export goods made with forced labor. What do we mean by forced labor? Well, these sorts of scenarios tragically play out all the time all over the world. For example, a desperate migrant worker charged exorbitant recruitment fees for a job opportunity, but they don't have that money, so that's debt worked off, often with debilitating overtime, their movement restricted, passport seized, housing cramped, trapped in a cycle of never-ending work. The U.S. Trade Representative points to universal international consensus that forced labor should not be tolerated. It goes on to cite the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and calls the elimination of forced labor a moral and economic imperative. So, tariffs.
The Trump administration has announced a new set of tariffs, slapping import taxes of 10% or more on many of its closest trading partners.
On the surface, this feels like a fairly straight line. You do bad things, we, the US, punish you, hit you with this big economic stick. But is it as it seems? Or does the US have a different play here?
The goal that they want is to be able to impose tariffs. This is the game that's being played.
The first thing to notice that should make us all ask questions is on whom and how is the Trump administration imposing these new tariffs? There are 60 economies, including the entire European Union. And at first, it is hard to imagine how we're comparing apples to apples if Canada, the UK, Nicaragua, and China all appear on the same list. But taken in groups, you have most of the major oil exporters to the US, most of Asia's biggest manufacturing exporters, and nearly all of Latin America's major exporters. Together, they represent more than 99% of US imports in 2024.
It's more the trade side of things that has determined the selection. So what are the major trading partners of the United States? And those have been then included in the 60 countries, rather than those where forced labor imports are a particular problem.
But the US Trade Representative argues forced labor imports are a particular problem. And he's right. We tend to see forced labor in industries that are labor intensive, low skill with high turnover. From the fishing industry to the painstaking and repetitive work of garment makers, backbreaking construction work can also be rife with abuse, as can domestic work for women in particular. We see the same in mining all over the world and in farm work. Basically, in conditions where the human body can be pushed to its limit and where profits are made in volume. And the US position is that not only is this morally corrupt, it's commercially unfair, even if your country isn't directly abusive. Because, and I can give you an example, imagine India exporting solar panels to the United States. India itself might not rely on forced labor for this work, but maybe it imports from China the solar cells that make up the panel, or it makes those solar cells using imported polysilicon from China. This creates a dilemma because Chinese supply chains, especially in the Xinjiang region, have long been a focal point for human rights groups. And the US itself even has a law on the books which creates an automatic presumption that basically anything mined or made in Xinjiang was produced using forced labor, unless importers can prove otherwise. So maybe you're a country that didn't directly employ forced labor, but you still benefited from forced labor, which allowed you to cut your costs by 80%. You undercut the competition because you had no standard of care for the humans who made your product. That's the argument, anyway. But the point being, it's not just forced labor, but forced labor inputs, where the production chain is long and at various points not really up to America's stated moral standard. Clothes, a pretty common multi-stage product, which, if not itself manufactured using forced labor, maybe they're using Chinese yarn or Chinese cotton that, again, can be traced back to regions where the US presumes forced labor is the norm, and which the US says, therefore, justifies taking action. not against only a few of the worst offenders, but against almost all of its biggest trading partners. Except we can try to see through this. The question we're really asking here is this really about forced labor? Or is forced labor just a convenient and compelling reason to do something else?
What is the administration actually using this for? They have a habit, and we've seen this repeatedly, of taking legislation that's intended for one thing and using it to do something entirely different.
And this is where this term sometimes comes up, stealth tariffs, which means something slightly different in different contexts, but in this case, it's questioning whether the US actually wants any of these countries to do anything about forced labor, or whether it's all just a meaningless pretext.
We've seen this with the fentanyl issue. There has been a genuine concern, I think, by the US administration that fentanyl imports are a source of damage, harm done to the American population. Similarly, I think there's a genuine concern around forced labor. That's one side of the equation. That doesn't mean that all this cannot be a pretense for putting in place a legal basis for putting in place across-the-border tariffs.
It's absolutely an unconventional approach, but I think that the way the US government would describe it is as a reset of the global trading system.
So let's consider the evidence for that. First, that there's very little, if anything, offered in the American plan here that constructively helps solve the problem of forced labor. There's no forced labor task force, no benchmarks, no best practices, no eagerness to engage the wider community on a multilateral level. Or, I don't know, if tariffs are really the way to go, why not tariff the specific products you believe are made with forced labor? Or the specific companies that use forced labor, as opposed to slapping tariffs on basically every single country that exports any appreciable amount of stuff to the United States. Second, and on the other hand, for such an apparently principled stand, you'd think there'd be a slightly shorter list of exemptions. Like, I'm reading this 93-page memo from the US Trade Representative, where his office writes about the imposition of ad valorem duties, tariffs, on all products of the 60 economies subject to investigations, except as provided in Annex A. And I'm thinking, okay, there's some carve-outs, except Annex A is 76 pages long and includes everything from orange juice to airplanes. And when I read the list, I see things that fit into two broad categories. Either they're things the US needs and can't easily replace, like crude oil or critical minerals or industrial chemicals, or things the US doesn't want to become even more expensive than they already are, like coffee or beef or certain fruits and vegetables, because that might become a political problem.
Basic basket goods that are affecting some of the affordability conversation. That's probably a significant component of the basis of what ended up in that Annex A of these exceptions and exclusions.
So, at the very least, we have an administration cracking down, but in a way that doesn't exactly scream, this is about human rights. Which is fair. I actually think the US has been fairly transparent about saying this is chiefly an economic issue. The failure of our most important trading partners to address the importation of goods made with forced labor is unacceptable. This creates a dynamic where American workers are forced to compete globally on an unlevel playing field. But this is not new, and it's certainly not something the US itself isn't also a part of.
Let's be blunt. If the issue is forced labor, prison labor, then the US talking about other countries is worse than the pot calling the kettle black. The US has one of the highest uses of prison labor, which is forced labor, globally.
What most experts seem to agree on is that imposing tariffs against virtually all of America's major trading partners is not a good faith attempt to solve the issue of forced labor. It is, rather, a reaction to one of the greatest setbacks Trump has faced in his second term.
The U.S. Supreme Court has struck down most of Donald Trump's tariffs on global trading partners. Trump lacked the authority under an emergency powers law to impose the levies.
If you were to name just one policy point that means more to Trump than any other, I think it would be tariffs. When he was stunned back in February by a Supreme Court decision that ruled many of his emergency tariffs illegal, forcing his government to begin a process of paying back a big chunk of that tariff money it collected, the Trump administration very quickly, almost immediately, imposed another 10% across-the-board tariff, but using a completely different legal mechanism, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. But this was, again, back in February, and only valid for 5 months, which, if you do some counting on the calendar, lands you with a deadline of somewhere in July, where Trump needed to come up with yet another legal pathway to ensure his global tariffs stayed right where they are.
The Americans are searching for a new way to implement those tariffs, and they're going through their bag of remaining presidential tariff authorities to figure out how we're going to get tariffs.
It's my understanding that the investigation has targeted 60 countries. So all of these 60 that have been investigated are guilty, which already tells you something, because it was a predetermined outcome.
Where I'll admit this all gets a bit murky is that there's no single clear black and white way to look at this. Forced labor is a global problem. Even a country like Canada is guilty of at least benefiting from a system that exploits millions of people around the world. So Trump's new legal pathway to reimposing tariffs that were struck down as illegal is more of a question of motivation than fact. I don't know whether tariffs are an effective way of stopping forced labor, but I do know what it demonstrates. And that is, very simply, if this US government wants tariffs, it'll find a way to get them.